Hello, good day. Welcome to my online class. For today's video, we will discuss about Vygotsky's theory of cognitive development. So let's start. So who is Lev Vygotsky? Born in the middle-class Jewish family in Orsha, a town in northern part of Bielorussia, and moved out to Gomel. Little is known about Vygotsky's youth except that in his early years he was educated by a private tutor and that he later went to a combination of public and private schools for his secondary education. As a young child, he was interested in verbal arts like literature, poetry, theater, and philosophy, and would lead discussions on major topics in these areas because of this he was often called the little professor. He also attended the University of Moscow out of glance and pursued degrees in medicine and law. He also taught at Gomel's Teachers College, where he started a small psychology laboratory. It was during this period between 1917 and 1924 that Vygotsky became more deeply committed to the field of psychology and education. He took charge of creating a Marxist theory of psychology and child development, aiming to reconstruct the fields of psychology and education in the Soviet Union in ways consistent with the social and cultural changes taking place around him. He also published a number of important articles in special education, or what was then called defectology, or the psychology of children with mental or physical abilities. And sadly, he died of tuberculosis in June 1934. Now let's go to Vygotsky's theory of assumptions. So to him, learning precedes development. Next, development involves internalization of signs acquired by an individual from others so that he can think and solve problems by himself or herself. The zone of proximal development is the level of development immediately above a person's present level. Learning takes place when a child is working within his or her zone of proximal development. And later on, we will discuss also in this video the zone of proximal development. Next is scaffolding, is the support for learning and problem solving. So, uh, which uh, which can be clues or reminders, encouragement from other people, maybe older or peer, breaking the problem down into stages and providing an example or anything else that allows the children to grow in independence as a learner. Now let's see or let's discuss also the Vygotski's key influences. So three characteristics mark Vygotsky's work. First, a sincere dedication to Marxist social philosophy and conviction that psychological development was intimately linked to the tenets of philosophy. Next is a thorough acquaintance with the work of leading European and American psychologists of his day and earlier decades. And the last is a great ingenuity in devising methods for studying children and for interpreting the data his methods produced. In coming up with this theory, Vygotsky, Vygotski's work has two major goals. So first, to create a Marxist psychology that both solve problems in the field of psychology, and next is to help children with various physical disabilities and psychological problems. And the last is to guide people in newly designed country. So related to this, utopian communism, three core assumptions. So these core assumptions were adopted by Vygotsky in the formulation of his theory. First, activity generates thinking. So thinking does not initially create action. Instead, action creates thought. Mental development is the process of children's internalizing the results of their transactions with their environment. Next, development advances by dialectal exchanges. So Vygotsky proposed that children go about the activities of their lives, their established ways of doing things, and do not always work because these ways fail to accommodate to the conditions of the current situation or the so we have the thesis and the antithesis. Hence, children must devise a new problem solving methods that satisfy those conditions or the synthesis. The last is development is a historical process within cultural context. So Vygotsky adapted this model in formulating the child development model. The model postulates that in understanding children, it is important that we become familiar with the nature of the culture's historical background because in the environments that children inhabit confront children with opportunities and demands unique to that culture. And furthermore, the history of the child's ontogenetic development determines how the child is prepared to resolve upcoming problem situations. Now let's discuss development of thought and language. The child's thought and speech begin as separate functions with no necessary connection between them. So, like two separate circles, as the child begins to grow up and the two meet and overlap, the juncture of the two represents verbal thought. The two, the thought and the language, never completely overlap. There always remains some nonverbal thought, like adults' skillful use of tools and some non-conceptual speech. Example, adults singing an old song. While admitting the necessary role of internal maturation and development, Vygotsky believed that children informal and formal education through the medium of language strongly influences the level of conceptual thinking they reach. So, like Piaget, Vygotsky developed a theory explaining how children develop their thought processes, and he proposed the following stages in conceptual development. Now let's go to stage one, the thinking in an organized um, congeries or hips. Congeries or hips. So let's begin with the trial and error stage. No? Beginning by trial and error stage, the grouping of disparate objects together is the first step of concept formation for the young child, and it implies a diffuse extension of the meaning of the word or its substitute sign. Only the subjective bonds justify his or her choices. The word meaning is syncretic linking, or the attempted reconciliation or union of different or opposing principles, practices, or parties of objects in the child's representation and perception in a single image. It is by chance that meaning attributed to word map in the child and the adult because it is linked with concrete objects in the child's environment. Next is so this is a step is determined by spatial position of experimental objects. The related impression is a subjective one linked to the child's immediate perception. And finally, the step ends with the unstable syncretic image or the consciousness that the child hips element is a token of a single meaning. Now let's go to stage 2, thinking in complexes. Individual objects are united in the child's mind not only by subjective impression but also by the bonds that actually exist among the objects. So this stage is comprised of 5 sub-phases. So let's begin with associative complexes, which is described to be an understanding of an object that is linked to the nucleus of the group to be built if the child can make any concrete associative relationship or by similarity or by contrast. Letter B is um, in collection complexes, there is no hierarchy or hierarchical bond between the various characteristics. Objects are linked on the basis of Some feature in which they differ and complement one another may be heterogeneous or complementarily. For example, glass, spoon, and plate. Next is chain complexes. Focus on objects that have nothing in common with some of the other elements either and yet be parts of the same chain of the strength of sharing an attribute with still another of its elements. For example, the sounds a child uses in imitating animal sounds. So, for example, dog. Uh, it can be ow, 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 or woof, woof. Maybe the same sound he or she vocalizes when milk is accidentally spilled. Next is diffuse complexes where the relationship between objects is marked in the fluidity of the attribute that unites the single elements. For instance, yellow triangle, then triangles. So you can relate triangles to trapezoids, square, hexagon, circles, and many more. The last is pseudo-concept complexes, refer to words that externally looks like a concept but inside it is a complex. For instance, if the child gathers all the triangles, it is because in fact they really look like one another. He or she an associative complex which fits in the adult's complex. The pseudo concept is a bridge between the concrete thought by intuitive images and abstract thought of the child. Word meanings as perceived by the child refer to the same objects that adult has in mind. That ensures the understanding between the child's complex and adult's concept. For instance, the word dog for the child fits in the real concrete complex. For the adult, with the abstract one, this stage is still found in adult thinking. Vygotsky made an important distinction between pseudo concept and true concept. True concepts. True conceptual thinking requires that a child spontaneously groups object on the basis of abstract characteristics that she perceives and not simply applies ready-made labels that he or she has been taught to use with other groupings. The last stage is thinking concepts. Synthesizing of phenomena that share common aspects and analyzing phenomena by singling out or abstracting elements from them. A single attribute is abstracted to form the basis of a collective. The child has begun to operate with concepts to practice conceptual thinking before being aware of the nature of its operations. This peculiar genetic situation is not limited to the attainment of concepts. It is the rule rather than an exemption in the intellectual development of a child. The concept is not limited to generalization. To form a concept, it is necessary to abstract, to single out, or synthesis must be combined with analysis. Now let's discuss the zone of proximal development. The concept of more knowledgeable other is integrally related to the second important principle of Vygotsky's work. So this is the zone of proximal development. This is an important concept that relates to the difference between what a child can achieve independently and what a child can achieve with guidance and encouragement from a skilled partner. So let's study this illustration. So, for example, the child could not solve a jigsaw puzzle. So, in this example, um, I cannot solve the jigsaw puzzle by itself and would have taken a long time to do so, if at all, but has able to solve it following interaction with the father and has developed competence at this skill that will be applied for future jigsaws. So Vygotsky sees the zone of proximal development as area where the most sensitive instruction or guidance should be given, allowing the child to develop skills they will then use on their own, so developing a higher mental functions. And then Vygotsky also viewed interaction with peers as an effective way of developing skills and strategies. He suggests that teachers use cooperative learning exercises where less competent children develop with the help of more skillful peers within the zone of proximal development. So the evidence for Vygotsky and the zone of proximal development. Freund conducted a study in which children had to decide which items of furniture should be placed in a particular areas of a dollhouse. Some children were allowed to play with their mother in a similar situation before they attempted it alone. So meaning that's the zone of proximal development. While others were allowed to work on this by themselves, which is Piaget's discovery learning. Freund found those who had previously worked with their mother, or the ZPD, showed the greatest development compared with their first attempt at the task. So the conclusion is being that guided learning with ZPD led to greater understanding or the performance than working alone, which is the discovery learning. So that ends our video for this lesson, and here are our references. So an article from Simply Psychology and from the book Child and Adolescent, or the Learners and Learning Principles. So again, thanks for watching. Stay safe and ganbate kudasai, or always do your best. Bye-bye!